a week or so into the Israel-Iran war, and America is edging closer to direct involvement. But while most of the media's attention has focused on whether or not military intervention will succeed in either destroying Iran's nuclear facilities or bringing about regime change, surprisingly little has been paid to the question of whether or not America can actually afford it in the first place. So, in this video, we're going to talk about 3 senses in which the US might not be able to afford a war with Iran. First, the federal government doesn't really have the money. Second, the wider US economy will struggle to cope with any external shocks. And third, it's not clear that the US can deal with Russia, Iran, and China all at once. So let's start with the first and most obvious problem, namely that it's not clear that the US has the fiscal space to pay for a war with Iran. As we've mentioned in a million other videos, the US is currently running a pretty massive budget deficit, representing about $2 trillion or over 6% of GDP. This is pretty massive by international standards. For context, it was the largest in the OECD apart from Israel, roughly double the EU average and about 3 times the advanced economy average. The deficit is only expected to grow in the coming years, largely thanks to Trump's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, which the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget expects to add at least $3.1 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the One Big Beautiful Bill will push the deficit to over 7% of GDP and America's overall debt burden past its World War II peak in 2029. Anyway, you get the idea. America already has a massive and unsustainable debt problem. While flying a few bombers over Iran's nuclear facilities might not cost that much, there is of course a real risk that the US gets dragged into a more protracted conflict, as tends to happen with these Middle East misadventures. The wars in Iraq and Syria, for instance, are estimated to have cost the American taxpayer nearly $3 trillion, while the war in Afghanistan is estimated to have cost another $2.3 trillion over 20 years, according to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. In the years past, the federal government might have benefited from investors' flight to safety during times of geopolitical turmoil. In other words, you might expect investors to react to war in Iran by shifting their cash from riskier assets like stocks to safer assets like American government bonds, which would have made it easier for America to finance any war. But Trump's tariff turmoil has eroded America's status as a financial safe haven, as evidenced by the steady decline in the dollar recently and the associated rise in American borrowing costs. So, America might not benefit so much from any flight to safety. This creates a further risk. If war with Iran pushed America to the cusp of a debt crisis, Trump would likely resume his assault on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's current chair, Jerome Powell, has signaled in recent months that he won't cut interest rates, which help America borrow more money unless he's 100% sure that inflation isn't going to come up again. This is why Powell has refused to cut rates recently. Despite the fact that US inflation has come in below forecast for 2 successive months, he's not sure what impact the tariffs will have. So he's decided to wait it out. War with Iran would introduce yet more uncertainty into the picture, and Powell would probably respond by further delaying any cuts. This will make Trump increasingly tempted to get rid of Powell, as he threatened to do a couple of months ago, and replace him with someone more pliant who would cut rates and maybe even restart quantitative easing, essentially print money and give it to the government to help the US finance a war without tax hikes or spending cuts. This would both undermine the dollar's reserve status and stoke inflation. And, this brings us nicely onto the second way that America can't really afford a war with Iran. It's not clear the US economy can even afford another external shock. Even if America just launches strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, Iran will probably respond by disrupting global oil markets, given it's the only way that the Ayatollahs can really inflict pain on the US. This might include attacking oil facilities in the Middle East, which is what Iran did in 2019, or closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which something like 20% of the world's oil passes. This could have a catastrophic impact on oil markets. JP Morgan, for instance, estimates prices could reach $130 a barrel, higher than their peak in 2022. This would be disastrous for the American economy, given that the previous energy price spike pushed US inflation up to nearly 10%. This could all be compounded by the delayed effect on tariffs. While U.S. inflation has come in impressively low in recent weeks, at least some analysts think that's because the inflationary effect of tariffs has been delayed. Both because of front-loading, meaning American companies are importing their stuff before the tariffs come in, and because American businesses are keeping prices stable while they run through their stockpiles. Once these stockpiles are exhausted, however, inflation could tick up. And if that happens at the same time as, an acute oil shock, the U.S. economy will be hit by an inflationary double whammy. Or a triple whammy if you include the dollar's recent weakness, which has made imports more expensive. Anyway, the third and final sense in which the U.S. might not be able to afford a war with Iran is less economic and more strategic. Namely, that war with Iran and being dragged back into the Middle East more generally distracts America from confronting China, which most of Washington considers to be America's primary geopolitical threat. This was an argument frequently made by Elbridge Colby, who's currently serving as Trump's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and has long argued that China is America's main strategic challenge. Given America's finite strategic attention, Colby argues the U.S. should therefore focus its efforts on the Indo-Pacific and withdraw from both Europe and the Middle East, which is why Colby has previously opposed U.S. strikes on Iran and advocated for the drawing down of military aid to Ukraine. Colby clearly hasn't been listened to. The U.S. is still very much in Ukraine and poised to strike Iran. But if he's right, and the U.S. can't cope with Russia, Iran, and China simultaneously, protracted involvement in the Middle East will undermine America's ability to deal with what Washington sees as the China threat.